So we're discussing governance structures, but also kind of legal and financial um, things just to really think through as you're planting and as you're uh, just trying to plant smartly, trying to have everything organized before you get started. That way, things don't catch you by surprise. You can start healthily, you can start efficiently. And so your online lecture covered a little more of the governance structure, congregational led, elder led, bishop led. We talked about the different ones, and so you have a lecture early on that. But today we have Mr. Ronk in class to discuss with us kind of organizing the legal and financial structure of a church, which is really a lot of times I think it's kind of left behind. It's assumed it's just happening, or it's assumed that QuickBooks is handling everything, and as long as we're paying the bills, we're okay. So, anyways, Mr. Rock here is Piedmont CFO, and he, what, 8, 9 years ago, left his position here at Piedmont. He was the controller accountant. He left his position 6 years ago to help with a church plant in Arkansas. There was a new community that was booming and growing, and so he left with left with a plan to really just an active member, and not as a assistant pastor, associate pastor, or anything, just really as an active member. But he really helped lay out a lot of the financial structures and really help the church in that way. So if you can find that person to part of your core team, do that. It would be essential, especially if that's an area that you're not familiar with. So Mr. Ronk is going to really just kind of go through, he's got this outline, you have it in your notes in Blackboard, we've got printouts here as well. And so Mr. Ronk just kind of go through, just, really just some good, these are very highly practical things, so take good notes. That's why we sent you a Word document so you could type on it and go back. This will be recorded, so you can go back and watch it later, of course. And so be sure that you are kind of following along. He's got some good links for some of the stuff that he'll be discussing through. So, and feel free to ask questions throughout. This is an area that I honestly am very weak in if it weren't for my wife, who also is a accountant controller. So she understands this. I can take this to her. She goes, oh yeah, I know. I get this kind of stuff. She knows the where to and how. So, anyways, Mr. Ronk, why don't you take it away?
The document that I have for you is really a guide to give me some talking points if you're not talking or if you're not asking me questions. So if you have questions that are very specific to maybe a situation you know about or you're dealing with or you've always wondered about, make sure we cover those things. And I'm happy to go off the path here and kind of go down any rabbit trails you want to pursue, and then I'll bring it back as we need to. What time do I need to stop?
9:15 is when class ends.
Okay, so we got plenty of time. Yeah. And a lot of the things I want to talk about more than just the financial, there's the financial side of a church or any organization that's ongoing, it's constant, and that's something, you're not going to just take a class and become an expert on. But a lot of what we're going to talk about this morning will be like a one-time thing. You do it up front, and then you kind of move on. Unless you go plant another church, then you've got to revisit all of that again. So a lot of these things are going to be one-time things. So that means you don't really need to spend a lot of your time becoming an expert, because you're going to do it once or maybe twice or 3 times as the Lord gives you opportunities to plant new churches. But what I hope to do, if you see at the end of the handout, I've got that big bold closing statement, know when to seek advice or assistance. What I hope to do is help you kind of see where you ought to get some assistance, get somebody who really knows what they're doing here, and not feel like you've got to be an expert on these things. The classes I teach here for the management for nonprofits, a lot of times I emphasize that you can't possibly be an expert on these matters by taking a class. But I hope in the class you'll see where to raise a flag of, I need some assistance, I need to call somebody, I need to look something up on the IRS website or something like that. Because I think a lot of times we get in trouble if we just fly blindly and not think about the fact that this could have long-term effects, negative effects, if we don't address it right, if we don't do it right from the get-go. And setting up a church, as I'm sure it applies on the spiritual side of things, it certainly applies on the practical side of things. If you build it right from the beginning and you set those things up initially in a proper manner, that's going to have huge positive impacts for a long time, for many years to come. But if you do the opposite, you do it poorly, you're going to carry those problems, and they're going to haunt you, whether it be financial problems, legal problems, or whatever the case. So I just want to walk through some of these issues that are kind of the hot topics when it comes to organizing a church from a legal standpoint, and then we'll touch on some of the financial things that apply to it as well. Does that kind of make sense? And then the examples that I gave you, you've got a link there. You can open some of these. These are, I'm going to mention some examples of a lot of the things that we'll work through. So section 1, I'm really starting with the question, should you incorporate when you start a church? Are you familiar with what I mean by incorporate? Is that okay? And that's fine. If I use terms, if I use terms that aren't, I'm really nerdy about it sometimes, and I might start, forgive me if I do, and just stop me and say, I don't know what you're talking about at this point.
Yeah, our church was actually in the process of incorporation.
Really? So it's been operating for a while, and now it's incorporating?
Okay.
Yeah. That's not uncommon. So, in fact, you don't have to incorporate, and that's kind of why I put this question here. Should you incorporate?
Yeah.
My opinion, and I'm not an attorney, you ought to seek an attorney's counsel on this, especially based on the state that you're going to be in. And let me frame everything we're going to say. Almost everything I'm going to talk about this morning is state specific. I'm going to speak in terms of North Carolina and a little bit of Arkansas and a little bit of Virginia, because those are the 3 states I'm familiar with, but there's 47 other states that might have different rules. And most of the states are there's some common threads, at least in theory they're common. So they won't be drastically different, but you ought to always work with an attorney or someone who knows that state, or spend a lot of time researching the rules in that state, or have somebody who can do that. So in most states, you can start operating as a church just by saying, we're a church, and that makes you officially a church. That actually makes you officially tax exempt in most states. There's a problem with that, though. In fact, if you look at some of the cons that I listed there, actually, no, it's under the pros. You don't get what I state there, some of the pros of incorporating. You don't have clear property ownership. If I just say, we're going to start a church today, well, if we take up an offering, whose money is it? There's not a legal entity now that has that can hold that money. I can go down to the bank and open a bank account for our church, but the church is going to say, well, let me see your organizational documents. They're not going to just let you open up an account under an alias, especially in the post 9/11 world. They're going to want to see documentation, social security numbers of officers, and lots of information that you didn't have to deal with 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. But in today's world, it's going to be very difficult to do banking transactions, for example, if you haven't formally established a church. Incorporating is one of the most standard ways to formally organize. But again, you don't have to incorporate. Incorporation is this. You set up articles of incorporation, and we'll look at an example of what that means in just a minute. It's basically a page or two of statements that you sign, you file them with the state stamps it, and they say you're incorporated. That basically just creates a legal entity that's not a person. It's separate from the people. It's controlled by people, but it's a standalone entity that the state can deal with, the bank can deal with, people can donate to, and so forth. So it creates that legal organization. So under the pros again, you can have clear property ownership because now you have a separate entity that has an official name that's registered with the state and essentially with the federal government after that. There's liability protection. When you have a corporation that's separate from us as a group of people saying we're going to have a church, there's an automatic built-in corporate liability separation there. In other words, if someone walks into our church and trips and falls and they break something, if we just kind of organize the church, the 4 of us, they could sue all 4 of us, and our assets could be at risk. That's not a good thing. If you have a corporation, the corporation can be sued, and they cannot reach past the corporation. The legal term there is they can't reach through. The only way they can reach through the corporation and get to you is if you did something grossly negligent. So if you put up a trip line at the door because you thought it would be funny, and then they tripped, now they can reach through and sue the pants off of you, and you might lose something.
It's like a sermon illustration how Satan trips us up.
Yes.
We probably don't want to do that, literally.
Mental note.
So,
trip lines.
There is a myth there about liability is that, well, I can't be sued. There's no way possible because it's a corporation. Well, that's not true. Again, if you're grossly negligent, and the courts are normally pretty conservative, I guess would be the right term when it comes to this. In other words, they're going to they're going to err on the side of the corporate, or I'm sorry, they're going to err on your side. If you're the pastor, you have a corporation, somebody sues the corporation and you, they're going to treat you pretty kindly as long as you were acting in good faith. So they're going to say, would the typical pastor with common sense operate this way? And if yes, then you're okay. Does that make sense? But if you did something really stupid and it was, you purposely tried to deceive somebody, or you purposefully did something that is frowned upon, then you could be held liable. So that's one issue. Without the corporate status, though, it's very easy to go after you and your assets. So that's a pretty important point that you ought to consider. Number 3, under the pros of incorporation, is that it's much easier to conduct business. As I mentioned earlier, you can open a bank account. If you're going to buy a building, if you're going to build a building, if you have a corporation, you have an entity who can do that. Without that, you've got a little group of people that it's going to make it more difficult. Who really owns that is the issue. And if you don't have clear ownership, guess what happens when Sally over here gets mad at Jimmy over here and they decide to take half the church with them? What happens? Well, now you've got a legal battle for who's taking the building, and who's taking the cash, and who's taking. So just to prevent that, you set up a corporation so that the corporation can't be divided up among members. And the articles of incorporation, the bylaws, and so forth would dictate what would happen to those assets. And the pros under number 4, essentially you're going to be subject to the same rules and laws either way. There's this myth out there that says, well, the minute you incorporate your church, you're subjecting yourself to the state. You're saying, okay, you come in and tell me what to do now. And that's the big argument out there for not incorporating. But I would say, and most legal experts that I've read and my experience would be that you're going to be subject to the same rules anyway. It's not like because we didn't incorporate, we don't have to abide by certain laws. If you're going to have to abide by those laws anyway, the incorporation argument kind of seems to go away for me. Now there's some good people on the other side of this that say don't ever incorporate a church, it's heresy, it's wrong. I'll leave that to y'all. That's for you to decide between you and the Lord. The cons out there, the first one I stated, says that the state should not have authority over the church. They say, well, the minute you incorporate, you're subjecting yourself under the authority of the state, under the government, and that's obviously wrong, and so forth. But as I put in parentheses, is that really the case? If you look at what's really happening there, you're not subjecting yourself to any further rules. There's no new laws that you suddenly have to abide by. Everything that I'm going to talk about in here that I can think of as far as legal issues that a church has to think about, you're going to have to do that whether you're incorporated or not, if you want to operate. Number 2, a lot of people say, well, it can make people very uneasy. There's a lot of people out there who they're just not comfortable with this. If your church was going through an incorporation step, you probably have people in your church going, I don't know, is this like the next Adolf Hitler thing, or did you have any of that?
Well, a couple people.
Sure.
Yeah. And
that's very common. You ought to be sensitive to that and help people walk through that.
Yep.
Encourage them to research it. Don't let them just go read the latest sites on Google, especially the ones that look like they were created in the mid-'80s. There's a lot of garbage out there. There's a lot of false statements that are really poorly constructed. Find good attorney websites. There's a lot of law offices that offer things that even answer the question, should a church incorporate? You can read exactly what the pros and cons are from a legal standpoint. Understand that with any issue, there's always some group out there, some extremist group. There's a whole group. In fact, we used to have a professor here when Dustin was here. I don't know if you know who it is, but he was associated with what's called the unregistered church movement. And he had a friend who had already gone to prison over this. They refused to pay any employment taxes. And his friend was in jail up in Michigan, and they thought he was a hero.
So he's almost like a martyr type thing. He's suffering for Jesus by being ignorant, really.
Yeah, exactly. And employment taxes was all it was dealing with. I mean, that's, so if you work for your church, I guess you guys are on staff, and you have paychecks, I assume.
You get very small paycheck.
Okay. If it's a real paycheck instead of like a 1099, I don't know if you get paid as a 1099 contractor or as an employee on a W-2, but if you get a W-2 paycheck, they're withholding some kind of tax on you, right? So when they withhold those taxes, they have to forward those to the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't forward that to the government, you're stealing from the government. The government will come and take you to jail, right? Well, that's what this guy did, and he's like, well, I'm not going to let the state tell me what to do. Well, I think Jesus dealt with that. That's my personal feeling, and I think you'd probably agree with me that Jesus says what's on that coin, and it's Caesar, and it's, well, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, and if they have rules like that, you comply with them, unless it's violating scriptural principles, unless they're coming in and telling you what you can and cannot preach and so forth, and that's a different issue. But this was a matter of taxation. So be careful where you draw those lines and so forth. But incorporating or not incorporating doesn't change that. That pastor would have gone to jail one way or the other because he was holding federal money and not submitting it.
Is some of the fear, you mentioned like some of the fear of people making them uneasy, would it be like if we incorporate in their mind, we're becoming the government now kind of runs us, so to speak. Now if we refuse to do a gay marriage, or we will not hire a homosexual for staff. Is that kind of some of the fear?
Absolutely it is. And, in an earlier generation, those weren't the social issues. There was something else. It might have been, they're going to tell us what version of the Bible we can, whatever it is. There's always something that there's going to be a fear factor there that the government's going to tell us what to do. I don't know of a case where the government has clearly come down definitively on an issue that the church couldn't put into practice, where they forced it that the church didn't win the appeal. I can think of a few times where some people crossed the line, like this mayor in Texas a while back who wanted transcripts of the sermon. Well, that was overturned. That was ridiculous. That would have never stood. Yeah. Will that change in America? Probably. In fact, what I really think, and I've got it in here somewhere in the outline, I think you as a church planner or a pastor or anybody associated with the church, you ought to realize that in your generation, by the time we pass, I think our churches will be at a point where we'll need to pay normal taxes like a normal business. Or if nothing else, the deductions that people claim now for their tithes and offerings that they claim on their taxes, I think that'll be done away with. I think we ought to prepare for that day. And they're going to tie it to things like discrimination of homosexuals and gay marriage, performing those in your church. And so if you don't comply, then they can take away this privilege. Tax exemption is a privilege. It's not a mandate from God's word that I can find. I don't know if you can find anywhere in there that says thou shalt be a nonprofit if you're going to be a church. But our government has said there's a privilege here because we respect the role of the church in our society. We want to encourage the role of the church in our society, so we're going to give this privilege called tax exemption. A privilege can be taken away, right? I don't personally feel like that's a hill to die on. I'm not going to, refuse and go to jail over paying taxes as a church. I think a church ought to just be smart and say, one day that's probably going to come, and I ought to figure out a way to pay those. Every business out there pays taxes and they can operate, right? Church can do that too. We can figure out how to do that. We can work that into our budget, and we'll be okay. The gates of hell will not prevail against us. It will follow God's word and only die on the hills that He's told us to die on, and not turn little things like that into something bigger than what it is. So yes, some people think, well, if I incorporate, that's going to subject us to more of that. But again, whether you've incorporated or not, you're subjected to that. If you're just a mom and pop cake factory like the ones we've seen in the news, they're not incorporated necessarily, and they're under the same penalties, and they're getting sued over not making a cake for certain groups, right? Same thing if you're a church that's unincorporated or unregistered. They can still come after you for those things if they want to. It's not going to change the fact whether you're incorporated or not. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Again, to summarize all of that, my opinion, my advice would be to incorporate as long as your state doesn't have some huge hurdle in the way of becoming incorporated. As far as I know, Virginia is the only state out of the 50 that has a little different category for a church, and they don't want you to technically incorporate. They have a registration process, but essentially it's the same idea. So I don't know of any major hurdles to just going ahead and going forward with the incorporation process. So that's what I want to talk about, is how do you do that, some of the very basics, so that you're familiar with the concept, the steps, and so that you can appoint somebody to do that, because it's probably not going to be the thing that you want to spend all your time on as a church is getting started. If you go with a mission board or a church planning organization that has experience in this, they're probably going to have templates. So that's good news. If you go, I assume the
North American
Mission Board. Yeah. I assume that they have probably a packet that you can download. You can probably even find it for free right now, and there's probably forms that you can just print out and put your church's name in the right spot and move on.
And they have consultants that actually, once you've been assessed and you get into the process, even though you're working out of a local church, they'll say, your local church can help you as well, but we have consultants and coaches to help you with that as well. So they walk you all the way through that whole process.
And even very small mission boards. Continental Baptist Missions is who our church plant was with, and it's compared to that, it's a very small organization, and they had templates, and they had. Now we didn't use some of that. We kind of followed a different model, but that's hopefully an encouragement to you that you don't have to create all this stuff from scratch. So let's just talk about what it takes to incorporate under step 2. Again, this is a state level thing. Here's kind of the way it works in a kind of a overview. You file with the state to become incorporated, and that makes you officially a corporation. Then you have to file other things with the federal government if you're a typical nonprofit to get tax exemption. The church does not have to do that next step. Church is automatically, under federal law, you're automatically tax exempt just because you're a church, whether you incorporate or not. If we just right here said we're going to start Upstairs Baptist Holiness Church of the South, then okay, the church is established, we just wrote it on a piece of paper, we're tax exempt all of a sudden. That's how easy it is at the federal level. So let's just talk about it at the state. Articles of Incorporation, that's one of the links I gave you that shows you our Articles of Incorporation in Arkansas took up 2 pages. And they have to cover certain things. They're going to name the corporation. As you see, I mentioned there under point 2, I would suggest that you do the minimum on the Articles of Incorporation. And again, you're not going to see in this, you're not going to see we will never perform marriages for anybody other than a male and a female. You don't have to put any of that in here. The Articles of Incorporation require a corporate name, so you got to name your church. Okay, that locks in your name so nobody else can steal it. But speaking of that, you ought to do some research and make sure you don't steal somebody else's name, because you could be held liable for that later. The state will tell you, at least North Carolina does, we don't take responsibility for this. You chose a name that's already taken, somebody else wants to come after you, that's up to you to deal with.
So it's only the if someone wants to come after you.
Sure.
Okay, because I'm thinking you got Giant Calvary in Winston, then over in King you have Calvary Baptist as well, and so okay, it's only a matter of if.
Yeah, and if the church wanted to get nasty and they've registered their name properly and all that, they could, I guess. I'm not an attorney, but my understanding would be that they could stop you from using it. So you want to be careful of that. Now you could just simply say Calvary Baptist Church of King as your corporate name. That doesn't mean that's what you have to put on your sign.
Mm-hmm.
You can put Calvary Baptist on your sign, but your corporation name could be Calvary Baptist Church of King.
Yeah, so there's a lot of First Baptist churches
Yeah.
in North
Yeah.
America that would have I guess whoever has the most money, maybe First Baptist Dallas. They've got.
Well, it'd be whoever did it first could or whoever properly registered it would be the one who could.
I bet they'd make a killing if they sued.
But most of those churches probably, if you look at if they incorporated, they're probably First Baptist Church of something in their corporate name. You do want to be distinct in your corporate name because, number one, you don't want to receive bills in the mail if the other church that has a similar name has done something wrong. You don't want to get that correspondence. So that's another reason to have a nice distinct name in what you file for. So the Articles of Incorporation are going to say, here's what our name's going to be, here's who our registered office is going to be. That's just basically who do we contact if we have a question. If the state needs to get something to you or somebody contacts the state about your church, who do we contact? So you just list out who that is. You list out who the incorporators are going to be. That's us 3 are starting this. We're going to be the incorporators. That's a one-time thing. Doesn't matter who that is. It can be just one person in most states. Most states just require one person to be the incorporator. Another issue you've got to deal with in the Articles of Incorporation is, will the corporation have members? Now that's a little trickier than you might think, because the first answer would be, well, of course the church is going to have members. This is members of the corporation. And here's what that means. A corporation can be can have a self-perpetuating board. In other words, there's going to be a board that controls it, a board of trustees or a board of directors or whatever. That self-perpetuating board can just elect new board members, and that self-perpetuates, right? Does that make sense? The other alternative in a corporate standing would be to have members who elect the people who will run the church. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So if your members are going to be the ones who are appointing officers and the directors, then you want to say, yes, we will have members. And then you'll need a process of how those members do that. It depends on how your church is going to be organized, and it sounds like y'all are already talking about that. Is it going to be run by a board of elders? Is it going to be run by a congregation? Those issues ought to be addressed first and planned out, and then talk to an attorney about how you ought to put that in your articles of incorporation. Does that make sense? Because if you say it's going to be member run, and then you organize it as a board run church, the members could actually come back and say, no, we have the power.
Wow.
You follow me?
Yeah.
They could legally come back and say, no, we get to abolish this board, we don't like it, we're going to put another board in place.
So I've got Life Springs here. It says the corporation will have members. So you are in essence you are a congregational led church.
Yes.
By saying that. So.
Yes. Now, the bylaws of the church could say that this is the limits of those members. So there's other ways to address this.
Okay.
You just want to make sure somewhere in the organizational documents that it clearly delineates who's got what power.
Okay, so you say it has members, but then your bylaws will say here is the extent of the role of the members,
Yes.
what they can. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, and just so I understand about the whole member situation, it sounded like what you were saying is that you have to list specific members, or
No.
just how
say that
it's
we're gonna-
operating.
how it's going to operate.
Yeah,
Now-
okay.
now-
Of course, this corporation will have members.
Yeah, and you don't have to, in the articles of incorporation, you don't say what the members do. You just say if it's going to have members or not.
Yeah.
They just want to know what kind of structure this corporation's going to have. Then in your bylaws, which is not filed with the state, you can say anything you want, just about, as long as it doesn't violate law. We'll get to that in a minute. So, and then further down, somewhere in your articles of incorporation, you have to have what's called a dissolution clause. As a nonprofit, most states are going to require this, and the federal government is definitely going to require it if you file for tax exemption at the federal level. You have to state somewhere in your founding documents what happens to the assets if you go out of business. As a nonprofit, as a church, you can't just dissolve and say, okay, everybody take home 10% of what's left, and that can't happen because you are considered a nonprofit at that point.
I know a lot, this is kind of plug in, when Mike Sowers was here for chapel, he talked about the gathering place. That's what that church in essence did. In their dissolution clause, they said our assets would go to the Baptist State Convention of North Carolina to be used for however. The state convention came in and said, now that the building's kind of ours because this church dissolved, we're going to start this new work out of it. So that was essentially what they did. So a lot of, in Southern Baptist churches, you can do that with the local association or the broader state convention.
Yeah.
And you want to think through that because you might tie your hands to somebody that 30 years from now you don't want them to have the assets. So you can say something as generic as, if we dissolve, all assets will be transferred to a like-minded organization selected by any existing members at the time of dissolution.
So the church, and so that could be maybe if they say something like that, and a new church is coming to town, they're looking for a place to meet. This happened up in the First Baptist Rural Hall. They dissolved, but they gave all their stuff to Rebo Church, who then took over, and that was the church vote, and I guess that would have been listed in there.
I assume their dissolution clause, if they had one. A lot of older churches didn't have these, and today you want to definitely have that.
Yeah, we've got one in ours. Can you go back and change, like let's say I was the one who was going to get all of it from Friendship, and I goof up, make everyone angry, they kick me out, and they want to go back and change that.
Well, number one, they can't say that it's going to go to a person. It has to go to another nonprofit.
Okay. All
It
right.
has to be somebody who's eligible to receive those assets. So you can't say all of this will go to Jimmy if we close. Again, the private inurement is a big issue. That means that the earnings of the corporation can never inure to the benefit of a private individual. It's not like if I open a coffee shop and then I close it, I just keep what's left. You can't do that. It's a nonprofit. It has to go into another nonprofit or back to the state. That's what the state's going to do. If you don't follow this right, they're going to say, well, then it's ours. We'll put it in the public treasury. You don't want that to happen. You want it to go to a nonprofit. But yes, if they chose, let's say they chose X association over here, now we don't like them anymore, right before we close, we can vote to change our articles of incorporation. Now that's a little bit trickier to do than anything else that we're going to talk about. Once you file the articles of incorporation, they can only be changed by filing articles of amendment. So you'd have to have formal vote, and then your rules would dictate Can it be changed with a majority vote, or does it have to be a 2/3 vote, or does it have to be a 90% vote? You've got to decide that up front and put that in writing. So then, if let's say it's got to be a 2/3 vote, you're getting ready to dissolve, and you say, well, we don't like that organization, we need a vote, but only half the people vote, you're stuck. Or that only half the people affirm that, then you're stuck. So again, you just got to think through some of these things.
Yeah.
And hopefully you will never close, but you just want to plan it. And most states are going to require you to at least address it.
Yeah.
And then some states are going to require a few little pieces. You'll see some blurbs in here that's just a copy and paste from the state. As long as you're okay with it, it's nothing doctrinal. It just says that no individual is going to take money to their own benefit other than a normal salary, stuff like that. Stuff that you should agree to anyway. So you create all that in a short document. Like I said, it's one or 2 pages long of a few statements. You sign it, whoever the incorporators are going to be, and it could be just one person, it could be the pastor, whoever. You sign it and you mail it to the state. The state's going to stamp it, and you're a corporation now. Now you can go and file for a tax ID number so that you can go down to the bank and open a bank account. And that's how easy it is to get started. You can do it in your kitchen and be done in about a week and have your church fully incorporated. It's going to cost you like $50 depending on the state to have everything done, filing fees and whatnot.
It was Jonathan Dillon, the pastor, that you went
Yeah,
with? 'Cause I
he's
see
the
his
church
name on the
planner.
bottom.
We chose to just do one person to keep it simple and just put his name on it, and you'll see kind of how we progress through that. So if I was going to do it again, I would follow the same model we followed. I think it worked well, where we just planned, we kind of had our own plan of what we're going to do. So we met at his kitchen, we drew up articles of incorporation. We didn't know who else was going to be there. We had just moved to the area. We picked a name, we incorporated, we sent the papers off, and we started the organization. Then I could turn around and do the next things we're going to talk about. Notice under the point though, under articles of incorporation, you could also include other things. You could say this is what we're going to do, this is our purpose, this is our mission statement. I would not put those things in there because again, if you change those in any way, you've got to file new articles with the state. I would just put the bare minimum. Now, if your name changes, you've got to file an article of amendment. Now we're going to be LifeSpring Community Church, so you'd have to file new articles to do that. But that's not too difficult. I'm just saying that's one of the reasons to put the bare minimum there. You don't need to tell the state anything that's not required. Okay? Don't get into, are we going to baptize by immersion? Just leave it all out. Just put the bare minimum there. Now your bylaws is a different story. Your bylaws, a lot of churches call these the Constitution of the church. Some organizations combine their articles and their bylaws and then call that the Constitution. The Constitution is whatever you want it to be. But the bylaws, from a legal standpoint, are the kind of the operational policies that are going to control what can and cannot be done in a lot more detail than the Articles of Incorporation. But the bylaws are not filed with the state. They're not filed with the federal government. They're internal, but they are binding, legally binding. So if you violate your bylaws and someone sues the church, you will lose if you did not follow your bylaws. So if we say, here's how we elect a pastor or appoint a pastor, and you do it a different way, somebody could say, I don't like him as pastor, I'm suing. And guess who's going to win? That person. They're going to say they didn't follow the corporate bylaws. The good thing with corporate bylaws are you can change them internally by whatever procedure you put in your first set of bylaws. So in your first set of bylaws, you ought to say the bylaws can be amended with a 70% or 60% vote or whatever you want it to be.
Or by the Board of Elders or something like that.
By the Board of Elders or a majority of the Board of Elders. I mean, you want to be very specific.
Okay.
The 2/3 majority of the Board of Elders. If a Board of Elders is not functioning at the time or does not exist at the time of more than one member, then the church, you got to address some of that. Because when you're a new church, you might not have 4 people yet. You might only have a pastor. And so I don't know if you'd call that the Board of Elders yet. So one of the things we did with our bylaws, or what essentially we called our Constitution, and I don't have the whole thing printed out here, but you'll see it somewhere in there. Actually, it's on the first page. Provisional Constitution. We said we acknowledge that this is a new church, and this is going to be a growing document. We're going to operate under these bylaws for now, and then we'll probably change them when we see the need to. I would suggest doing that, because when you set up your initial bylaws, you might not have a full board that's functioning, and you might not have a treasurer yet, you might not have a building yet, you might not have a thriving children's ministry yet. So some of those issues that you're going to address later, they can be added later.
Since this isn't registered with the state, do you get it notarized, or is there anything you do to protect it so nobody can just go in and edit it or something?
That actually brings us to a point that we'll get to later, but we'll go ahead and jump to it. You want to appoint a secretary. You gotta appoint. The incorporator can do this from the get-go, and that's what we did. We incorporated. Pastor John was the incorporator, so that his first act of business, and I gave you actually the minutes from our first meeting. So this was like right after we got our articles approved, we had a meeting in his kitchen, and it says, being the sole incorporator, John Dillon acted as chairman. So he suddenly made himself chairman of the corporation. And after he called the meeting to order, he appointed Chris Ronk, that's me, to record minutes, and made him the secretary and the treasurer. Once he says that, and I put it in the minutes, it's done. I was the secretary and treasurer of the corporation at that point. So you want to appoint a secretary very, very early on who will keep minutes like this and sign them, and normally you want to have 2 people witness it. Those minutes, the recording of those minutes becomes your proof to protect your bylaws. If you can't find minutes that show that you changed your bylaws, then the original bylaws would be the ones that would probably prevail in some kind of legal battle.
So you do recommend having 2 lines of signatures?
Yes.
Because we just have someone who just writes it down in a notebook.
Well, I would suggest, and this is not legally required, but the best practice would be that your whoever your voting group is, whether it's a board or a congregation, they ought to approve the minutes of the last meeting when they meet. So if we're meeting in June and we're talking about what happened in May, we ought to approve the May minutes.
Yeah, I think that's what they do.
And then when they're approved, you ought to record that in the next set of minutes. They were approved they were read and approved. And then what I always did was I signed it, and I had someone else, either the pastor or someone else, attest to the fact that that's what was really said and passed. It covers you if you're ever in a lawsuit, or if you ever kind of, unfortunately it happens. It normally doesn't end up in court, but it could end up in mediation where somebody wants to block the renovation of the church because they don't like the color of the carpet. You've got bylaws that said this was approved, we're following our procedures here, and you're going to win that argument. Wow. I almost hate talking about it because it kind of feels like it's sucking in all the ministry out of the church. So understand, this is not to be priority. This is to make sure you're covering your bases so that you can focus on what's priority.
And this is really not a weekly thing you're dealing with.
No.
This is your business meeting, whether quarterly or whenever they are. And I mean, honestly, updating a church's bylaws and constitution is probably not a thing that even happens yearly. It's
like every 10 years or something.
Yeah.
Now, a new church, you might have a preliminary constitution, and then you revise it 2 years later to kind of finalize it.
Yeah.
What we did is we operated under just pure articles of incorporation until we had a group of people, and we set kind of a date for an official charter Sunday, and then we worked with those individuals, the men in that group especially, to come up with our initial constitution. We wanted them to be on board with this, and then at the charter meeting we appointed members, which basically, because of the way this articles were structured, Pastor John could just wave his magic wand and say, you're all members now. Not really, but you get what I'm saying. It was him to appoint the first members, and then the members, their first action was to approve the Constitution. So that way the Constitution was not just one man saying this is what we're going to do. It was a group. And again, we were constitutionally or congregationally organized. I know we're jumping around a little bit, so please ask questions or interrupt me wherever you want to. But your Constitution and your bylaws, what I've got down there, it can be done in a later time. It can be done in stages and phases. It ought to cover major policy issues, internal administration, who can count money, who can touch money, who can write checks. That ought to be covered in there. Don't leave that unaddressed. It ought to cover how members join, how members get kicked out. It ought to address how a pastor can be removed if need be. Unfortunately, those things happen. And you ought to have procedures already dreamed up. And if the pastor doesn't want to come up with a plan for that, then you ought to question whether or not you want to partner with that pastor. Every person has the ability to fail, and we need to know how to deal with that.
So if a church is like practicing church discipline, and they would you want to put into the bylaws we are following, this is our pattern for church discipline. It's kind of like a
Absolutely.
Matthew 18 type system.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was actually going to ask that same question.
We have, I don't have the whole Constitution printed out, but if you look in ours, we have a disciplinary procedure outlined in our bylaws.
Okay.
And again, that's probably going to be some templates you can copy and paste other people's and read through it and see if it really lines up with Scripture, and then use their wording, because especially if you can find an organization that's had good legal counsel. Christian Law Association's got a lot of good resources there. So church discipline ought to be in there. Dealing with disagreements ought to be in there. And what you can do is I'm positive we did it in our Constitution. We definitely have this in our bylaws here at Piedmont. We say, if there's a disagreement that can't be settled, then after all appeals that have been previously mentioned in the bylaws have been exhausted, we will follow the Christian conciliatory rules set forth by the peacemaking organization. Have you ever heard of the Peacemaker, Ken Sandy?
Mm-hmm.
It's a book called The Peacemaker. It's his organization. It's really fantastic. But they have a set of rules that have stood the test of time in court of how to find Christian mediation and come to a resolution. And so in your bylaws, you can just simply say, we're going to follow the current rules set forth by that organization, because they already have it. And that way you don't have to keep up with all the latest changes of the law. You just say, when that time comes, we're going to go to their website, download their procedures, and follow them. Now, we're putting a lot of trust in that organization, but it's a very well trusted organization. It's a lot of Christian ministries use that.
It's just called Peacemakers.
Yeah, Peacemakers. Ken Sandy,
Ken Sandy.
Sande, I believe, is the president. He's the one that wrote the book, but I think it's called the Christian Conciliatory something. Anybody have the Constitution up? You can find the exact wording there, but issues like that you want to think about, what issues are we going to really need to make sure we address here, so that when that time comes, what you don't want is to have to make up a policy when the problem comes. That's what you don't want. Now we've got 15 people really angry, they're threatening all kind of stuff, and we don't have a policy to deal with this. It's too late then to have a vote. And I have a family member dealing with that in a church right now, where the constitutional committee is trying to take over basically, and there's no good policies to prevent it.
Yeah, Christian Conciliation Handbook, and it's on the peacemaker.net.
There you go.
So
you can just copy and paste that paragraph if you're comfortable with that. You ought to go and look at those steps, but they follow Matthew 18. Have you done this? Have you done that? Have you done that? Okay, if you've done all of those things, we're going to bring in a mediator. And essentially you're saying by those bylaws that we as an organization and anybody connected to us agrees to abide by whatever the final mediator says. So that independent mediator is going to come in, he's going to listen to you, he's going to listen to you, and he's going to make a decision, and that stands. You try to go to court after that, the judge is going to throw it out and say, sorry, you agreed to mediation.
Wow.
Which keeps it biblical, it keeps it out of the courts.
Yeah.
It keeps it as a Christian, a godly man who comes in and sits down and listens to it and decides. If you get to that final point where it couldn't be resolved in the church.
Was the Constitution or the bylaws, are they done from scratch, or are there also templates that?
There are plenty of templates. You definitely want to edit those more. The articles meet state requirements. In fact, you can probably get the state template and just change the name and a couple of things, because that's not dealing with anything scriptural or doctrinal issues. The bylaws is a different issue. That's where I don't think you ought to just use somebody's template. That's a good place to get started to make sure you cover the issues, but you ought to customize every one of those things just about.
Okay.
Are you going to associate with certain types of organizations? If you want that to be in your bylaws, then put it in there. Are you going to allow, what's your stance going to be on certain types of marriages and the use of your buildings and the use of will your pastor perform certain ceremonies? And if you want those kind of things in there and you think those are important, then do it. If you want to leave it open for the pastor to make his own decision, then leave it out of the bylaws. Don't tie his hands. Those are all things you've got to think about and decide. And that's church by church.
How can you legally get around gay marriage? I've heard
You need to have it in your organizational documents. In fact, our bylaws here, and I would recommend, and certainly at Piedmont we've got it that way, I would recommend that your bylaws include a statement of faith. And your statement of faith or some kind of points of conviction ought to be very clear on what you believe about those issues. So far in America, the courts have allowed organizations who have it as organizational documents. They have allowed them to discriminate.
Okay.
on those terms.
So I guess that's what I was wondering, even if you put it in here, I was wondering if they can still say that's discrimination.
For now it's okay. So if someone was to try to apply to Piedmont right now and they were a heavy activist against, the Christian view of marriage, and we would say, we just don't feel like you're a good fit to come here to work or whatever, and they tried to sue us, we could easily go and say, look, we got points of conviction. These were approved by our board. They've been part of our organizational documents for years. It says marriage is this way, and this is what God says is right and what's wrong. Therefore, we're not going to allow it. And the court would stand with us at this point.
You say that, and what if this is happening to a church that isn't incorporated, that doesn't have it in their bylaws or constitution? And this actually may be more of a legal question that I just need to talk to a lawyer about, but someone comes after us because we're discriminating, and in the process we decide to put it in our bylaws and it's approved by,
if you put it in your
You
bylaws
see what I mean?
after you've already gotten somebody after you, then it's not going to help you in court.
that's what I figured.
Now, you might still win
Mhm.
in court. You would have to demonstrate that this is what we've always practiced, or this is what we didn't just do this to hurt this person.
So would having ties then to the Southern Baptist Convention, knowing the Baptist message and faith has in there specifically,
that would help you if you had ties,
Yeah.
even informal ties. You could say, well, this is what we in every other area. This is what we practice. Therefore, any normal person would assume that this is what we practice in this area as well. That would be a pretty good argument, I would imagine.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to camp on that though.
Right.
I would prefer to have it in my organizational documents ahead of time, and that's what Christian Law Association or any other organization is going to recommend that you be proactive.
Be a good Boy Scout. Be prepared.
Deal with homosexual issues. Deal with how are you going to handle divorce issues as far as leadership in your church? That ought to be done ahead of time instead of when the situation arises. You got to be proactive about what you're going to do with child sex offenders. Are you going to allow them to serve? Or are you going to allow them to teach a class? Or are you going to allow them in your nursery? All those things can be dealt with ahead of time, even if it's not in the bylaws. At least get a policy in place so that you're not responding to a situation. You're proactively already have it addressed.
We have a question from Josh online. He's just asking, talking about the bylaws and the marriage position disclaimer. Does that have to be filed with the state?
No.
Okay.
No, but you ought to have minutes that show that the church approved these bylaws on such and such date, to show that those bylaws were already in place when this person showed up wanting to.
So it only would be needed, so to speak, it needed to be seen by the court if you actually were in court. It's not something you have to file with them so they have a record
That's
of
correct.
it. Okay.
It would be used in a defense.
Gotcha.
Is are the bylaws, should they be public? Like, do you want your entire congregation to know about these?
I would.
Okay.
I would have no reason to keep them private. In fact, I gave you these examples because we kept these public. We allowed. Now there's some minutes. I wouldn't share all the minutes because we talked about specific missionaries and support levels. That's not public. But a lot of things you ought to make very public. And your constitution ought to be one of those. In fact, most healthy churches that you'll find with a good website, they're going to have their constitution online where you can download it and look at it. We always required, we had a membership covenant that said, I've read the full constitution and I agree to support it and abide by it. So that they knew, this is my role, these are things that go here and don't go here. And so that you're all, and then here's the great thing about a membership covenant that says I've read it and I've agreed to it. 10 years from now, if they try to sue you for something that was in that constitution, the judge is quickly going to go throw that out. You agreed to that. Sorry.
Our church has we have about a 70-page partnership document, which includes a lot of extra things plus the bylaws. And so in our partnership class, you actually go through that, and then at the end of it, there is a sign-off page, and you take that and the elders assign it, and then your small group leader. So I'm actually signing for 2 of our new members who are in our group this week. So I met with them, talked with them about it. They signed it. They had to go through that partnership class, and the end says, we read and understand, we don't have any issue. And in there it talks about, here's how the elders lead, and this is our position on this, and this. Here's our bylaws, and it has a bunch of other things like we expect members to be tithing, to be involved. There's different kind of expectations laid out, and so if they ever come back and say anything, we have signatures that I get, and I turn that in to our treasurer. and she keeps those and that sort of thing. And we actually renew that yearly. So
That's
if we
excellent.
ever do change anything, we let everyone know these are changed. But every single, we call them partners. Every single partner, every January, I think January, February, we re-sign the partnership, and then new people do it throughout the year as well.
And that process can be in your bylaws. In fact, I would recommend at least some form of a membership process to be in your bylaws, so that if some member comes along and you make them do a couple of extra things, and they find out nobody else had to do that, now you've mistreated them. You follow me? So you ought to be consistent in how you exercise that. So if somebody walks in and they look a little different, and you make them go through some extra set of screening, and nobody else did that, you've probably made yourself liable.
So even things like if someone wants to volunteer in our children's ministry, they need to do a background check.
Everybody
subjective
ought to
this
get a
and all that.
background check, not just the one who looks a little shady.
Mhm.
Because when you do it that way, you've offended them, and it's really not good practice anyway.
Yeah.
So that's why early on you ought to have a policy, whether it's in your bylaws or not. At least have approved minutes showing a policy that says if you work in children's ministry, you have to have a background check.
Now I heard of a church. A pastor friend was telling me about this one. They had a registered sex offender who became a believer in the community through one of the relationships with another man in the church. And like 20 years ago, he had molested a child, and he served some time, that sort of thing. But he had become a believer, wanted to be discipled, wanted to become part of the church. But a lot of the parents were naturally just iffy, they want to show grace, but so he actually agreed, and they put into the bylaws afterward. The guy agreed that whenever I'm on the church grounds, I will never be alone. So they actually would designate when he pulled into the parking lot. Derek, for instance, would come up and meet him and just be with him in the same Sunday school class, walk with him, and anytime he left, and he agreed to it. He said, "I understand. I want to make sure the parents feel safe." And he was only part of the church for about 2 years, and he ended up moving. But for that time, he agreed. But they did put that in their bylaws. That was the first time that came up. So they voted to put in a sex offender policy and it worked well for them to have this as long as they agree. They are okay to, we would love for them to be members of our church, but they have to agree when they're on the church campus and ministries are operating that they have to be with another man.
That's
in the
very
church.
wise. And so to learn from that, and that's one of the things you ought to do too, is you ought to learn from what stories you hear like that and be proactive and get that in place.
A man wielding a gun.
Yeah. There you go. Well, we're almost out of time, so I don't want to miss a couple of really important things. Do you hear this term 501c3 organization a
All the
lot?
time.
Okay, a church does not have to file for that. You're automatically granted federal exemption. You can choose to do that. It's a Form 1023. It takes a while to fill out. You might get a professional to do it. I would. You do have to say a lot of things, though, if you do that. You will have to say, here's what worship looks like at our church. And I mean, it asks a lot more questions, but it's totally voluntary. You don't have to fill it out to get tax exemption. There are some benefits to doing that. I would not do it. Just because the benefits most of the time aren't much. I mean, you might get some discounts at a few places or some matching grants, but typically matching grant corporations are not going to do it just because you're a church anyway.
Mm.
So kind of thinking through the process, here's how our model worked and what I liked about the kind of order of the way we did things. We appointed some officers, i.e. me as a treasurer and secretary, then the two of us worked to get a bank account open, to get some action going. We started having some meetings, we started bringing some people in, started talking about the vision of the church, then we started meeting with that group of core people that were going to be part of that team. Then we formulated a constitution, we met several times for some breakfast meetings and that sort of thing, and got a constitution ready. We set a date for a charter day. Now, the charter day is an old term. It's just really a formality. There's nothing legal. There's nothing like technical that has to be done. It's just churches tend to like to have a birthday. Like this is when we became such and such church, and this is our homecoming weekend, or whatever we're 100 years old.
Launch day is typically
launch day might be a more contemporary. So you pick that day after you can have all this stuff already done, and then pick that day, and then have some kind of on this day we're gonna do this and this, and I gave you minutes from what we did. We kind of shared the history of the plant and talked about things, and then basically said, okay, here's a form that if you come up here and sign this form, if you've met with the pastor, you've signed the membership agreement and everything else, you come up here and sign this document, you sign the charter, you sign the launch, you sign the whatever. And now, so you are now the first members of this church. And then as soon as that was done, we said, okay, now we're going to call a meeting of the members, we're going to approve this Constitution that all of you have already read. And so it kind of sets a system of how these things are going to happen, because it's a very difficult cart before the horse kind of an issue when you're starting a church. You know, we did a lot of things before there was really a church, but we actually created the church before there was a church. You know, we created a legal church before there was a scriptural church. You follow me? You know, all of this is just legal stuff. You know, God has a plan for how church really functions, and it's a gathering of believers and so forth. So before the believers were even gathering, we did the legal stuff to get it in place. Then we were very transparent with those people and said, here's what we've done so far. If we need to change it, let's talk about it. But here's what we've done so far. None of this is irreversible. So don't feel like it's got to be perfect or anything like that. So that's kind of the model we followed. And then we passed, you know, we of course had the statement of faith embedded in that as well. Point 5, I just said be ready to pay your taxes. I think that day is coming. That doesn't mean the sky's falling. The church will survive this. We just need to be wise about it. You ought to appoint a treasurer as early as possible. Make sure that those records are being kept very meticulously. You want to have something formal that's reported on a regular basis so that there's plenty of transparency either to the church as a whole or to some board of elders. You ought to appoint a secretary early. That can be the same person for now. It can be a secretary/treasurer, which is my case. That person needs to keep meticulous records of every meeting and every decision and every document that's filed. They ought to be on top of what's required for that state. Every state has a different rule. You might have to file something annually, it might be quarterly, it might be never. You just need to find out. So, sorry.
Question
I
while
didn't leave
we're
a lot of time for question and answer, but
well, I think we got a lot of questions built in, which I think is really helpful. I did have a question. Whenever you're talking about appointing a treasurer or secretary, how important is it for it to not be someone like the pastor or one of the elders, like to have some kind of distinction, like you know, you didn't use Mr. Dillon as your secretary treasurer, obviously because he's a pastor,
or his
but
wife.
should his wife?
Probably
You know?
not.
Okay.
Now, if in the early days that's the best person and she's the most qualified, I don't think it would be a terrible thing to do, as long as you understood that it's a temporary thing and that person, that pastor and his wife ought to be very anxious to change that as soon as possible. But if you have nobody in the church or nobody available that has financial sense, and you know, in your case you've got a wife that's a CPA,
Right.
it probably makes sense for her to do that. But as soon as possible, get a real treasurer a different treasurer appointed, and let her do the bookkeeping. So you can have somebody doing the books and just have a treasurer who oversees it and holds her accountable to make sure that money coming in, money going out has some kind of
So you want a lot of eyes on things,
Yeah.
and a lot of transparency. Yeah.
Transparency will save you tons of trouble later on if you're just very open and upfront and careful with your record keeping.
We have 30 seconds for another question.
This question is actually on there. Can a church or nonprofit make a profit? Because I've never understood the term nonprofit.
Yeah. Your church better make a profit or it's not going to stay open
Right.
very long. And that's a misconception. The nonprofit means you're not, in fact, the more contemporary term is not for profit.
Yeah.
You don't operate to make a profit that gets distributed to people. That's the point. It's not being distributed to the president or the pastor or to the board.
Outside his salary.
Any profits, right. Any profits are reinvested back into the ministry and the mission. As long as the money's going back into the mission, you're fine. And that ought to have a profit. If you don't make a profit more than 2 or 3 years in a row, you're going to be closed because you're out of money, right? You're bankrupt. So you've got to make that profit. You just have to go back into the mission. You can't at the end of the year say, well, we had $100,000 surplus, so the board of elders decided to divvy it up among ourselves. That would be like, wait a minute.
Or to those who even funded you, because it's not they're not buying a stock, for instance. They're not a shareholder when they.
That's right.
I'm supporting Derek $100 a month for he's planting a church in Chapel Hill, which I'll do that one day maybe. It's not legally binding, but
it is now in the presence of.
But it wouldn't be giving. Oh, so thank you for being so generous, supporting us for these 5 years, and you want to give
refund back your
yeah.
tithe. Yeah, you can't do that either. Now there are some issues where somebody might demand a refund of their tithe because now you're doing something with it you shouldn't, and you know you can deal with that. There's ways to do that legally, but yeah, you can't operate for that purpose. And so to prevent a lot of that trouble, you really need to make sure you have some good compensation plans in place. In other words, who determines how the pastor gets paid? How is that money set, and is it a fair labor or a fair wage? If it's considered excessive compensation, the IRS can come in and penalize you and the pastor. Both of you can be held liable for that.
Is there a certain percentage?
No. The
that
IRS
you
will
go
not
on?
hold to a black and white number or formula. They just expect you to be reasonable. If they deem it to be unreasonable, they'll come after you and you'll have to prove that it's reasonable. There's a rebuttable presumption set of rules. It's an 8-step plan you can go through, but that's way too detailed. But here's the thing. If you've got 15 people attending your church and your pastor's making $500,000 a year, you're probably going to be in trouble. But if you're a mega church with 10,000 members and your pastor's making $500,000, they're probably going to be fine with that. Because the rebuttable presumption really, the biggest argument is to look at similar churches and what does their pastor make, and as long as we're in that range, we're okay. That's the rule of thumb.
Yeah, the Southern Baptist Convention every year from Guidestone actually puts out a report of here are the average salaries of pastors they do it by state, they do it by everything, and they do it by church size. So we're a church of 150 to 300 people. What's the average salary in North Carolina for a pastor like that? And that helps even when looking for a new pastor, even a church plan. Okay, so how much do we want to pay our pastor? That really helps. So there's a lot of those kind of resources.
And the ones that really get
out
in
there.
trouble are the ones who, dad is senior pastor, son is assistant pastor, wife is worship pastor, and they're all making 6 figures.
Yeah.
Then you really start getting in trouble there, and the pastor is determining what the wages are of those other people. I gave you some links to some publications. I encourage you to keep those as resources. I wouldn't expect you to read through those tremendously. I'd love to come back sometime and walk through some of the rules, but I'll say this, nonprofit management courses, we have a class you can take as an elective called Financial Management and Legal Issues. It's 7 weeks long, and we'll cover most all of this stuff in detail.
You do have an elective as part of this minor, and I'd recommend using an elective more than any other is one of the ones in the nonprofit, simply because that is something that most pastors just don't think through in a lot of sense, and so that class actually would
Financial
be.
Management Legal Issues is being offered in the spring first session, if you want to take it in January.
Mr. Ron, thank you so much for your time. This was
Absolutely, thank
it's
you.
beneficial. So.
Highly.
Good.